But there are a lot of complications that we're going to talk about. So the political meaning of demographic change is unclear. Just because these numbers are changing doesn't mean that the voting data are necessarily going to change. As we've said, the United States has had ethnic, racial, religious change throughout its history. That hasn't necessarily led to huge numbers or huge advantages for one political party. In some places, yes. In some time periods, yes. But it isn't as if the migrations of the late 19th century, early 20th century have sort of turned America into a liberal left society like many people might have thought back in the old days. America remains a kind of center-right country in many ways. And that is primarily through the descendants of those immigrant groups that had originally come and were originally socialized by the urban political machines of Chicago and New York City and Boston and Baltimore and places like that. So it hasn't turned out. Something's happened. Something's taken those Democrats and turned them into Republicans. What's going on here? As we've also said, the effect of minority immigrant votes are contingent. Just because you have a lot of Latinos voting doesn't mean that they're influencing things. You have a lot of Latinos in Texas and California. Have they really sort of changed the population? If they all sort of disappeared and went up into space on election day, would it really affect the outcome? In most places, the answer is no. As we've said, there's also lots of acculturation and assimilation that's been going on. The slow pace of demographic change means that all those numbers I showed you don't necessarily have any one dramatic effect at any one time. It gives the parties a chance to respond. The kind of conventional wisdom also ignores the success that the Republicans have had at certain times and in certain places with Latino voters. You think about Bush, not just nationally, but in Texas. You think about Florida politics. You think about a whole variety of other places where it's not just that Latinos and immigrants vote and they automatically vote Democratic. That hasn't been the case. But again, as I said, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So is there acculturation? Well, there's an argument out there that says, no, it's not, that immigration is completely fundamentally different now than it used to be. Mark Krikorian at the Center for Immigration Studies has made this case. He's talked at UT a couple of times. He's very interesting. And then you might parallel that with a book like this by Joel Perlman, Italians Then, Mexicans Now. So in other words, acculturation is happening. Just like it happened in the past, it's continuing to happen today. So which is right? Well, do Latinos acculturate? And I think the evidence is pretty strong, even overwhelming, to show that Latinos are acculturating. And there's a whole variety of data points that we can use. One of the classic in the assimilation literature is intermarriage. So intermarriage is part of what they used to call straight line assimilation, just over the generations. And so Perlman and Waters, this is in 2004, so it's a little bit earlier than today, but they found that Mexican Americans intermarry at the same rate as did Italian Americans of the same generation in the first half of the 20th century. So at least by these kind of classic markers of assimilation, Latinos are on path to parallel what happened with Italians and other migrant groups of the past. The whole idea that immigrants wouldn't assimilate, wouldn't acculturate, is sort of long-standing in American politics, and it's always proved to be wrong, but nevertheless it sort of recurs over time as everybody thinks that their time period is new. It all goes back to Benjamin Franklin in 1751. You've probably seen this quote before. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? So this is interesting for a whole variety of reasons. He's saying that these German immigrants will never assimilate, never acculturate, never Anglify. A couple centuries later, we've got General Eisenhower, who I think kind of proves him wrong. But he also says, any more than they can acquire our complexion. And this gets into the whole idea of sort of who's white. Well, whiteness changes over time in American history. Groups that were distinctly considered not white at certain time periods, like the Irish, like the Italians, like the Polish. We had a whole bunch of racial classifications like Mediterraneans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We had all kinds of classifications for people who were not considered white. But over time, who is considered white has expanded, and these groups start to parallel in their political behavior that of the groups that were there before. So you think about, you had the English, you had then Germans, and then Irish, and then you had a whole bunch of people from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Over time, these whole categories of who's white have really changed around. So the whole idea that there are whites and then there are non-whites just doesn't make sense in American history. If you want to look, for example, about two JFKs, John F. Kennedy in 1960, and who's the other JFK in 2004? John Kerry. Yes, well, John F. Kerry So in 1960, as far as survey research goes, pretty much every Catholic in America voted for John F. Kennedy. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but basically, yeah, almost every Catholic in America voted for John F. Kennedy. What percentage of Catholics voted for the other JFK in 2004? Well, probably less than half. So, and these things change over time, but yet there has been so much sort of anti-Catholic politics in the 19th century going well into the 20th century. Read something about the political campaigns and the arguments used against John F. Kennedy that were very sort of anti-Catholic. This is not that far in the past. I mean, this is just a little before I was born when you had this sort of anti-Catholic politics going on. But Catholics themselves have sort of changed. A group that many people said were fundamentally disloyal in an earlier time period are now actually more Republican than Democrat. They've moved to the mainstream. That's the critical point. Groups in America move to the mainstream. There's also a lot of research, nerdy research. I know not everybody wants to hear this in politics, but Mary Waters has done a lot of work, Tomas Jimenez, and here in sociology at Stanford, I believe still, have done a lot of research on this, and they argue that America continues to show remarkable progress in absorbing new immigrants. But today, because there is continuing migration in a way that wasn't true for all of the 20th century, it's hard to see sometimes. But if you look at the data, you start to see by all of these factors, Latinos are acculturating. In the National Academy's report from 2015, The Integration of Immigrants, you find that across all measurable outcomes, now that's a pretty dramatic statement, all measurable outcomes, integration increases over time. Immigrants are becoming more like the native-born, and the second and third generation become more like other native-born Americans than their parents were. So it doesn't mean that it's going fast on all variables, and it doesn't mean that there aren't sort of blips here and there, but if you want to compare it to the past, we sometimes don't know exactly how quickly and how well and how smoothly acculturation worked in the past for past generations of immigrants. So we might be sort of exaggerating a little bit how easy and fast it was in 1850 compared to today. It seems that it's pretty parallel. One of the complications of this whole story of demographic change is that you have contingent Latino power, which is that if non-Latinos are divided, sure, Latinos can be influential. But you don't find a lot of those places. So if you go back and look, let's say, from the 1980s to the present, and you examine presidential election outcomes in every single state, in every presidential election, and you look at what the vote margin was, and then you try to estimate what the number of Latino voters were and how they voted, what you basically find is that Latinos swung almost no states. And that's all 50 states for every election from 1980 to the present. You really just can't find examples where Latinos were somehow shifting things to Kerry or to Carter or Mondale or something along that, to use names from the past. There just aren't enough Latinos in the battleground states. Latinos are predominantly living in non-battleground states. I did some quick estimates last night. I think about, even by the broadest estimate of what's a battleground state, like including not just Florida, but let's say Georgia. Even by this broadest estimate, 75% of Latinos live in non-battleground states, and 25% live in quasi-battleground states. So we're talking about a Latino population that is living from a political point of view in a place where they're not very influential. The one place where you've had lots of Latinos and everyone thinks it's all about Cuban Americans, but actually the non-Cuban Latino population of Florida has just skyrocketed in the last decade. But you can hardly make the argument that Latino migration has contributed to the Democratic Party's revival in Florida. We just had an election there. Who won? Who dominates Florida politics right now? Is it the Democratic Party? No, it's not. You have to look at a relatively small number of southwestern states in order to find, I think, a sort of a reasonable indicator that Latino influence has changed the politics of the time. Colorado, possibly, we'll see. New Mexico, which has always been kind of Democratic. It had gone purple for a little bit. It's back in the Democratic category. Nevada, I think so. These are small. These are helpful for Democrats, but these are hardly like the political game changers we would think, given all the migration that's come to the United States since 1965. As we said, there's a geography problem for the Democratic Party. They, in general, have a geography problem nationally. People talk about gerrymandering, but it tends to be that every liberal Democrat in America wants to live in Austin or San Francisco or Manhattan. They don't want to live in South Dakota. They don't want to live in the places they could actually electorally make a difference. So Democrats are sort of packing themselves into particular places for a variety of reasons. I mean, we don't want to sort of overstate the sorting effect, but it just seems that in the gerrymandering argument, when you have lots of Democrats who are living in these sort of dense urban areas and Republicans who are spread out all over the place, it's just a natural advantage for the GOP. Latinos are often moving into the new destination areas as they're called in migration studies. I showed you that county map, but a lot of those people aren't citizens, or if they are citizens, they haven't registered to vote, and their turnout rates are pretty low. So that to the degree Latinos are moving into places where they could be influential, it's really going to be a long time before they exercise real political power. Latinos also vote at a really low rate. The self-reported rate is about 50%. You often see that in statistics. I showed you them earlier. I mean, does anyone really believe in self-reported voter data? Not really. It's probably more like 40% or something like that. And of course, a lot of Latinos, when you look at the population figures, they look really large until you start to realize, all right, it's a large, there's a large unauthorized population. There's a large legal but non-citizen population. There are a lot of Latinos under the age of 18, and when they do become 18, they vote at very low rates, just like young people everywhere, except here, vote at really low rates. And even when you become a legal permanent resident, it takes a really long time, like I said with the IRCA legally example, to become a naturalized citizen. Over 3 decades, only about 40% have become citizens from the 2.7 million legalized in IRCA. That's a really slow year-to-year number. So here's an example in a chart from the Pew about who voted and who didn't vote. And what you see is that there are a lot of people who don't vote. The actual voters are only 12.5 million. And the rest of the population didn't vote for a whole variety of reasons. So it's just that end part that's actually making an electoral impact, and the rest of the population is there, but not participating in politics for a whole variety of reasons. And there are other charts you can find online. The Pew has lots of them that show how the Latino electoral potential is much less than the Latino electoral reality. Eligible voters go up and up and up. Actual voters go up at a much slower rate. The midterm election was a bit of an exception. You also see this in presidential elections. Whites and African Americans turn out at pretty high rates. Latinos and Asian Americans, the two groups that are really driving the demographic change of the United States, vote at extremely low levels, and that's individual self-reports, 48 and 47% in 2012. It's probably almost certainly less than that.